In the spring of 1829, a tenant farmer plowing his fields along the Delaware-Maryland border made a discovery that would unearth one of the darkest criminal enterprises in American history. His horse suddenly broke through soft ground, exposing a hidden wooden chest buried beneath the soil. When the box was opened, inside lay the skeletal remains of a man, his bones aged, his skull scarred with signs of brutal violence. It was only the beginning. Over the next several weeks, investigators uncovered more graves on the same land. At least 7 victims were found, 3 of them children. All were linked to a woman whose very name was whispered in fear across the Delmarva Peninsula, Patty Cannon. For nearly 20 years, Cannon ran what later became known as the Reverse Underground Railroad, a network that kidnapped free African Americans and escaped slaves only to sell them back into bondage in the Deep South. But her crimes went beyond trafficking. Patty was also a murderer. She killed rivals, witnesses, and even children if they threatened her empire. Official court records from Sussex County, Delaware charged her with 4 murders, but witnesses insisted her true body count was far higher. Some claimed over 20. Before we go deeper into her chilling story, I want to ask you, where are you watching from tonight? Her network stretched far beyond Delaware, reaching communities from Philadelphia all the way to the Mississippi Delta. Share your city or state in the comments and make sure you subscribe to Sanctum of Shadows so these forgotten crimes are never erased from memory. The unearthing of those bodies in 1829 would unravel a criminal web that had operated in near total secrecy, protected by weak law enforcement, racial prejudice, and the cold reality that most of her victims were people society chose not to see. Patty Cannon's reign of terror was built in the perfect place for criminals, the borderlands. At the time, the area now called Reliance sat at the crossroads of 3 jurisdictions, Sussex County in Delaware and Caroline and Dorchester counties in Maryland. This strange geography meant outlaws could literally cross a line and escape the law. Locals called it Johnson's Crossroads, after a roadside tavern that would become headquarters for the most notorious kidnapping ring in early America. The land itself offered natural concealment, dense forests, swampy marshes, and the winding Nanticoke River that allowed traffickers to move people silently under the cover of night. Into this environment stepped Patty Cannon. Born around 1760, possibly under another name, she married Jesse Cannon, a quiet farmer. Together they lived on land that straddled the state line. Their house, simple on the outside, would later hide secret chambers where kidnapped men, women, and children were imprisoned. After Congress banned the importation of enslaved Africans in 1808, the value of enslaved people inside the U.S. skyrocketed. A man who once cost $300 could now sell for over $1,000 in the booming cotton states. For criminals, this was an irresistible fortune, and Patty Cannon intended to seize it. By all accounts, she was a physically imposing woman, nearly 6 feet tall in an age when most women were far smaller, with a commanding voice and violent temper. When her husband died under suspicious circumstances in 1826, some whispered she poisoned him. Patty was left in full control of the family property. Her isolation, the lawlessness of the borderland, and the prejudices of the time allowed her to build one of the most terrifying human trafficking rings America has ever known. Some neighbors did more than just turn a blind eye to the horrors unfolding around them. They actively fueled the enterprise. A few joined the gang outright, while others quietly provided intelligence about possible victims. Local shopkeepers sold Cannon's crew food and supplies, never daring to ask where the money came from. Even officers of the law were rumored to have accepted bribes, ignoring whispers of disappearances and suspicious movements at the tavern. But that silence shattered once white men began vanishing. The Cannon Johnson gang didn't limit their cruelty to free black families. They also preyed upon slave traders, white men moving through the region with pockets heavy from the legal slave trade. Unlike their African American victims, these men had partners, backers, and financial ties that demanded answers when they disappeared. Around 1820, the first documented case came to light. A slave trader from Georgia, some records call him Bell, others Miller, rode into Paddy Cannon's domain with a fortune in his possession. He carried as much as $35,000 in cash meant to purchase enslaved people for southern plantations. He was last seen at Cannon's tavern. Days later, his horse turned up in her hands. When questioned, Paddy claimed the man had sailed south with a cargo of slaves. Investigators saw through the lie. This marked the beginning of a deadly pattern. Slave traders were lured into Cannon's Inn under the guise of legitimate business. They were plied with alcohol, coaxed into boasting about their money, and then slaughtered once night fell. Their bodies were buried in wooden chests across the property. Their cash fueled the gang for months, and the human beings they transported were absorbed into Cannon's network and sold off through southern contacts. Eliminating these rivals not only enriched the gang, it cemented their grip on the criminal economy of the borderlands. By the mid-1820s, the pressure was mounting. Rewards were offered by Mayor Watson of Philadelphia, $500 for information, a staggering sum at the time. Governor John Andrew Schulze of Pennsylvania coordinated with Southern officials to track the fate of kidnapped citizens. For the first time, the Cannon Johnson ring was being hunted not as rumor, but as a system. The walls were closing in, and the gang responded with even more bloodshed. Witnesses were silenced, suspected informants vanished. Patty herself grew increasingly paranoid, convinced that betrayal was lurking within her circle. The gang's wealth by then was extraordinary. Contemporary estimates put their annual profits over $50,000, a fortune in the 1820s. But with every dollar earned, more eyes turned toward them. The turning point came from within Patty's own house. A boy named Cyrus James, mixed race, enslaved since the age of 7, forced to grow up under Patty's roof. For years he served as her decoy, luring unsuspecting black men and women into traps. He knew the hiding places, the routes south, the bloody methods, but as he grew older, Cyrus carried the weight of every life he had helped destroy. Patty held him in a cruel grip, sometimes treating him like family, sometimes threatening to sell him into the deep south where survival was nearly impossible. Fear kept him bound to her, but conscience began to eat away at that bond. He had watched children beaten to death. He had seen babies carried away in her apron, never to return. He had been forced to bury the bodies of those she murdered. Cyrus James was both witness and victim, living proof of the evil that had flourished in silence. By early 1829, the past began clawing its way back to the surface. A farmer renting land from Cannon was plowing a low field when his horse stumbled into the ground. Beneath the soil, hidden in a wooden chest, lay bones, the remains of the Georgia slave trader who had vanished nearly a decade earlier. This discovery was no accident of fate. It was the moment Patty Cannon's empire began to crumble. Authorities swept across her properties with search warrants broader than any issued before. They dug through gardens, outbuildings, swampy corners of land. What they unearthed was far worse than anyone had imagined. Following the directions of Cyrus James, who had finally chosen to break his silence, they uncovered graves containing children, men, and women. One child, James said, had been beaten to death. Another was killed simply because Cannon believed the child's father was white. Some bodies were found inside handcrafted wooden boxes built precisely to conceal human remains. In some cases, the bones suggested that victims may have been buried alive. The testimonies poured in: freedmen who had narrowly escaped her traps, locals who had lived in terror for years. Together with James's devastating account, they painted a picture of a woman who was not merely a trafficker but a serial killer who had operated unchecked for decades. On April 13, 1829, justice finally closed in. A grand jury indicted Paddy Cannon on 4 counts of murder. For the first time in American history, the law acknowledged not just whispers, but the systematic crimes of the most feared woman in the borderlands. Her empire had been built on silence, bribery, and fear, but now silence was breaking. The footsteps stopped just outside the storage chamber where James hid. Through a narrow crack between the crates, he could see a dim lantern glow. Sheriff Houston entered, his face tense, his eyes scanning every shadow. Behind him stood 2 deputies, rifles ready. They knew what they were walking into, a house soaked in secrets and death. Inside, the silence was suffocating. The air was thick with damp earth, decay, and the weight of decades of buried lives. Cyrus James finally stepped forward, trembling but resolute. He had lived in this nightmare long enough. Now, with everything on the line, he began to speak, his words unraveling the tapestry of horror that Paddy Cannon had woven. He guided the men to the places only he knew: shallow graves beneath orchard soil, chests hidden under barn floors, and a patch of earth where Paddy had once buried a child with her own hands. What they unearthed confirmed his every word: bones upon bones, tiny coffins, wooden boxes shaped to fit a body's form, each one a silent testimony to lives erased. For years, Paddy Cannon had ruled through fear. Her neighbors looked away. Officials were paid to stay silent, but now the evidence was undeniable. Cyrus James's testimony was relentless. He told of rival slave traders shot at her table, their corpses stuffed into crates. He described children beaten until lifeless, mothers sold into misery, men lured with false promises of work and then shackled in the dead of night. Every detail matched the bodies the authorities were uncovering. What struck investigators most was not just the scale of her crimes, but the cold calculation behind them. Paddy Cannon was not acting out of rage or desperation. She was running a business of blood. Each murder was profit, each burial was strategy, each disappearance a transaction to keep her empire intact. By the time the search was complete, dozens of victims had been confirmed, and still whispers suggested there were more, many more, who would never be found. On April 13, 1829, the indictments came down. Paddy Cannon was charged with 4 counts of murder. She sat in a Delaware jail, her reign finally broken. But even in chains, she carried herself as though untouchable, sneering at the men who guarded her. Some say she laughed when told of the charges. Others claimed she showed no expression at all. But the truth was clear. Her empire of silence had finally collapsed. The woman who once inspired fear across 3 states now faced the very justice she had evaded for decades. Paddy Cannon's story is not just a tale of crime, it is a chilling reminder of what thrives in darkness when society chooses to look away. She built an empire on fear, corruption, and human suffering, and for nearly 30 years she was untouchable. Until one boy, broken but unyielding, found the courage to speak. This was the final chapter in the reign of terror of Paddy Cannon, the most feared woman of the early American underworld. If this story chilled you to the bone, share it with a friend who loves dark history. Hit like to support our work and subscribe to Sanctum of Shadows so you never miss the next descent into forgotten horrors.